This podcast is brought to you by Villanova University on iTunes U. Please visit us on itunes.villanova.edu.
For many of the leaders in the eugenics movement, feeble-mindedness was the sort of root cause of many of these social problems, promiscuity, immorality, drunkenness, laziness, and so forth, that were seen to be plaguing American society. They believed that it all boiled down to feeble-mindedness. And that was a kind of a mushy term that roughly correlates with sort of mental retardation, and it was defined differently by different people. For most people, it kind of eventually crystallized into people who were just below normal. Not the severely mentally retarded. They weren't too much of a problem because they didn't breed too much anyway. It was the people who were just passing that you really had to worry about. And they believed this to be a simple Mendelian trait, and that you could trace it. I showed you a pedigree of this earlier, okay? And so that led to the fact that that the vast, actually that's getting ahead of myself. I'll come back to that in a second. But okay, feeble-mindedness, major, it's sort of the root cause of many of the social problems eugenicists were trying to address. I mentioned faith in government. So what do you do about all these social problems, trying to address them with the study of this new genetic science? They passed laws to restrict not only marriage, but also to sterilize people. And this was seen as a more humane way of treating that problem, because if you sterilize somebody, then they could marry whoever they wanted. Right? So you didn't restrict their liberty so much. They just undergo a more or less non-invasive procedure, and you send them on their way. And Harry Laughlin, the assistant director of the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island, now the site of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, drafted a model sterilization law in 1922. And that was because sterilization laws had been attempted to be passed since 1908, but they kept being overturned as unconstitutional. And so Laughlin said, all right, let's draft one that's going to be bulletproof against these constitutional challenges. And he succeeded quite well. The sterilization laws began to be passed, again, a new wave of them beginning just after that. And the sort of great test case was the well-known case Buck versus Bell in 1927. Many people have heard Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's famous comment, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This woman, Carrie Buck, was a domestic servant in a house who was raped by the son of the owner of the house, and she produced a daughter who was deemed at a tiny toddler age to be feeble-minded, and then her mother was retroactively diagnosed as feeble-minded, and so they took this all the way up to the Supreme Court. I'm less interested in Oliver Wendell Holmes here than in the news coverage of this story. They noted that this was written up as a step toward a super race. Charles Pierce, the U.S. Surgeon General at the time, said that the Supreme Court's decision is a step toward a super race, although it is but a feeble step. We have a lot more work to do, but this is a good beginning. Okay? So this shows that it's not that eugenics in the progressive era is not all negative. It's not all getting rid of defectives. There's a notion of the super race of human enhancement, right? Human perfection embedded in this. The two go together. Okay, I mentioned that sterilization laws began to be passed beginning in 1922. The next 18 years were really the golden age of eugenic sterilization. Are you coming up by yourself? Here we go. 27 laws were passed over those 18 years. Sterilizations in the U.S. Increased up to 1932 and then leveled off. A total of about 60,000 people were sterilized in this country. And eugenic laws spread around the world. It's not just here in Germany. It's one of the things that eugenics scholars have shown over the last couple of decades is that eugenics was really became a global phenomenon. And it had different flavors in different countries. So that's an important point. Now, as I said, there's both positive and negative eugenics, and I want to make sure to emphasize the positive eugenics side here too, because this idea of a super race was actually, in many ways, the prevailing goal of progressive eugenics. Eliminating defective people was the most easily solvable way to improve the population, but population improvement was really the long-term goal. Here on the left, if you can see it, is a sign for a fitter families contest. At state fairs, they would go around and have contests, sort of like you'd have your pumpkins and prize tomatoes lined up. They would have families. And they would be judged, and given blue ribbons for the most vigorous, the most normal, the most healthy and happy, and hopefully reproductively, fertile. And here on the right, an advertisement, are you tortured by fear of sex ignorance? All sorts of salacious kinds of things to lure you in to buy this book on eugenics and sex harmony. Presumably to help the best people have the most kids, and to teach you that if you weren't in that upper realm, that maybe you ought to hold yourself celibate. Okay, moving now to the next era into medical genetics. The canonical story is that eugenics was a bad period, and we sort of got human genetics wrong back then, and there was a sort of pseudoscience, and that when human genetics made this medical turn, then it became okay, and we started doing good science with it. And I want to say that it's a little bit more complicated than that. The early progressive eugenicists, as we've seen, were interested in disease, and the medical geneticists were still interested in eugenics. What happened in this period, beginning in the 1930s and accelerating through the 40s and 50s, and continuing on through today, is that eugenic authority shifted from geneticists, who gradually became disillusioned with the idea of eugenics, and shifted toward physicians. And physicians took over that mantle of being the primary sort of stewards of the eugenic program. And one of the reasons for that is fairly obvious: who performs the sterilizations, right? But it's more complicated. They were also beginning to identify more and more genetic diseases and so forth. And again, you see this idea of now, even though we know there's still a lot more to be learned, we know enough to get going. One of the founders of medical genetics, Lawrence Snyder, wrote that it is assumed on adequate grounds that most of the fundamental principles of heredity are now known in 1940. Okay? We didn't even know how many chromosomes humans had. It was still thought to be 48. Okay? But hey, let's get going on this. Okay. One of the reasons eugenics went from genetics to medicine is that it was actually due to public health. The rates of death due to infectious disease had been dropping ever since the turn of the century. And that unmasked hereditary disease. The fewer people died of tuberculosis or cholera, the more survived to live longer to die of heart disease and cancer, right? And so it was, at that time, so chronic and hereditary disease was becoming more and more of an important problem. It surpassed infectious disease in about 1910. And so a group of pioneering physicians started saying, well, okay, if scientific public health helped reduce the number of deaths to infectious disease, maybe we should take a public health model and apply it to hereditary disease. Okay? So we got these analogies between public health and eugenics. Madge Macklin, another one of the pioneers of medical genetics, wrote, speaking about typhoid Mary, of course, if we make a typhoid carrier give up her job as cook, isolate her, capture her when she escapes, and keep her practically a prisoner until she's rendered incapable of transmitting her disease, are we not justified in isolating and rendering incapable of transmission a person who infects not a few with whom he comes in contact, but the whole future race descended from him? Right? So the analogy here is quarantine for infectious disease, sterilization for hereditary disease. Right? Okay. So medical genetics began to develop in the 30s and 1940s. Two of the people who did this were this physician from Baltimore, moved down to North Carolina, William Allen, and here are just two quotes from him to correspondence between him and a philanthropist named Frederick Osborne. And it shows how axes we're changing here. Positive and negative eugenics. The groove I move in is a very narrow one in which I constantly encounter those who have inherited physical or mental disaster, blind, deaf, crippled, etc. And these derelicts constitute such a serious problem that I perhaps overemphasize the genetic end and think too little of the lack of good environment. Osborne, who was a patrician New Yorker, a very wealthy family and so forth, wrote back, I'm in an area of declining births, where the loss of good genes has us all worried. You are in a high birth rate area, where the constant increase of bad genes is a cause not only of anxiety, but of daily observation and distress. So, one person lives where all of these sort of poor, diseased, stupid people are overbreeding. Another person lives in a place where all the smart, wealthy, accomplished people are underbreeding. Both need to be addressed. Okay? One of the ways they did so was through the creation of Heredity Clinics, which were a very interesting kind of hybrid institution. They were part eugenics record office, progressive era style thing, and part modern medical genetics clinic. And the first three were established at Wake Forest. William Allen was the first director, one at the University of Michigan, another at the University of Minnesota. And then they began to spring up around the country until by the 1960s, virtually every medical school had a genetics clinic attached to it. Okay? And they saw new kinds of degeneration. It wasn't the overbreeding of the underclasses. The new degenerations included things like atomic mutation in the Cold War and ecological devastation, environmental, Rachel Carson and DDT and things like that. Okay? So in each age, there's a different source of degeneration coming out. In 1946, in November, just a few months after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hermann Joseph Muller, one of the founders of modern fruit fly genetics and a lifelong eugenicist, was writing about the possibilities of improving the population through genetic knowledge. He said, the day seems far off for so using our knowledge of the gene, but in these times of rapid movement in the physical and social realms, we might as well recognize this even more distant star to which our biological wagon is hitched. Well, it turned out to be not so far off as he thought. Okay, so moving on to the new biology, molecular biology, where Mendel's Anlagen, the factors that Mendel studied, began to be understood at the molecular level. And during this time, the fantasies of control sharpen and become newly, if still crudely, feasible. So this is the age of molecular biology, the double helix, the central dogma of DNA makes RNA makes protein, the Jacob and Monod's operon model of the gene. This is the kind of world that things are happening very fast in the 50s and 60s, and all sorts of new insights into how heredity works, how genes make proteins that make traits and make us. Okay? These insights were slow to be picked up in human genetics. In 1956, there was a first International Congress of Human Genetics. One of the greatest insights of that meeting was that, wow, we have 46, not 48 chromosomes. That was a shocker, and it led to the discovery of all sorts of chromosomal diseases, and the clinical development of amniocentesis. In his remarks for the meeting, the president of the conference wrote that the time is drawing near when man can control his own biological evolution and also command his environments and conditions of life to an increasing extent. Okay? So as human genetics is developing, they're getting the idea that the control of our own evolution is becoming more and more possible. It's not just genetics. To do this, genetics had to be combined with reproductive technology. Okay? So in this age, medical genetics also was referred to fairly frequently as preventive eugenics. Pavel Rees, one of the developers of amniocentesis I just mentioned, wrote in his paper in the 56 Symposium that determination of fetal sex through amniocentesis would seem to be of value in preventive eugenics. Okay? All right, so moving really briskly through this, we soon get test tube babies, in vitro fertilization. In 1978, Steptoe and Edwards create the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, and notice here, she's billed as super babe. Right? So again, this idea of a master race coming about through technology. And this happened to be the year that the $6 Million Man premiered on TV. Sperm banks, an idea of Muller's that was just sort of a pipe dream in his mind, but later a philanthropist named Robert Graham said, hey, well, why don't we actually do that? We could start a sperm bank with just the best sperm. And he thought it would be the Nobel laureates, right? Let's get the sperm of Nobel laureates, and we'll inseminate women with that, and then we'll create, all these brilliant people because genetics. And one of the very few donors to this program that we know of was William Shockley, who won the Nobel for inventing the transistor. He was a rabid eugenicist. After he won the Nobel Prize by the 1960s, he began this rant that would have made Charles Davenport blush about sending blacks back to Africa and all sorts of horrible things. And so he was one of the main donors. It turns out that of the babies born from this project, it operated until from about 78 to 1990 or so. Of the babies born from that project, they all turned out to be pretty normal, nothing really special. But the idea was there. We still want to believe in this notion that's going to help us create, help us improve the human race. So the take home here is reproductive technology plus increasingly great control over our genes leads to new power for controlling human evolution. Again, both the relief of suffering and human improvement working together. The new molecular biologists started, kept making these kinds of ideas, statements about having to improve the human race. Joshua Lederberg in 1963, writing on the new molecular biology, said that man, unless he grows less human, may destroy himself. Okay? He was thinking primarily of nuclear war. Okay? Molecular biology would make possible control at every level: environment, development, and heredity. So again, the idea of degeneration is present here, and human improvement. 3 years later, Severo Ochoa, one of the, also a Nobel laureate for his work on DNA, wrote, "What will be the practical implications of these remarkable developments in molecular biology? Will we be able to fix genes? Will we be able to make genes to order?" Pretty prescient for 1966. Again, it came about much sooner than he probably dreamed of. In about 1970, we can recognize a new phase of molecular biology, when we begin to actually be able to not just understand how genes work, but to work with them, to manipulate them. So gene cloning, restriction enzymes, molecular scissors that can cut the DNA at specific sites, recombinant DNA, genetic engineering, all of these developments in the early 1970s, stimulating great debate over concern over creating unstoppable pathogens and creating monster races of Hitlers or whatever. And again, the media coverage emphasized this idea of control of our own heredity. Scientists isolate a gene. This is for the gene cloning discovery in 1969. Step in heredity control, okay? Well, all this happened in a particular context. One of the themes I want to bring back again is that science doesn't occur in a vacuum. And so this was taking place in the, okay, 3 minutes, all right. Wrap up quickly. In the context of neoliberalism, beginning in the 1970s, the icon of this is Ronald Reagan. Small government, laissez-faire economics, and individualism rather than collectivism. Okay? Skip that. And this was, the development of the biotech industry. So they started, it started becoming a corporatized industry in which you could manipulate genes and try to create new drugs and understand disease and so forth. Very quickly, developments such as gene therapy, which they said would lead, again, inevitably to eugenics, the science of improving humans by controlling inherited traits. Skip this, and first attempted in 1990, and with apparent great success, but then unintended consequences, such as Jesse Gelsinger, who was undergoing a gene therapy trial at University of Pennsylvania, and then died of a massive organ failure that was still mysterious. And then a French trial for an immune disease that appeared to work, but then the girls died of leukemia because the gene that they inserted it at a spot that was just downstream of a promoter for an oncogene. Okay, so it starts to become much more complicated than they realized. Okay, all right. French Anderson was later convicted of child molestation. Just an example of hubris again, the excessive use of his power, tragic. Designer babies are coming back in with cloning at the end of the 90s. Again, language about the new eugenics, this time better than the old. And so headlines start to appear, about new methods will make designer babies, Brave New World language all over again, okay? And so finally, wrapping up in the genome era, variation, as we heard in the last talk, becomes really important. We discover, once we get the human genome, there's huge amounts of variation that we had no idea existed. So we have massive increases in computing power, big data, the SNP database, the HapMap, and so forth, new methods of visualizing data, comparative studies, and so forth. And what we see is lots and lots and lots of variation. So this returns us to William Bateson and his materials for the study of variation. And this, Takes us back to the GWAS studies we saw in the last talk, or 2 talks ago, the return of language of the gene for a lot of the same traits that we saw back in the progressive era. And this is, so when the media picks up on these association studies, they turn them into the genes for obesity, one-night stands, liberal politics, laziness, love of pork, the God gene, okay? So, you know, we just want to believe that there's this nice, simple genetic explanation, okay? This was, struck me so much that I wrote a blog post saying that there was a GWAS study showing that thalassophilia, finding the gene for thalassophilia, and this is I got the most hits of any post I've ever done on my blog. Thousands of hits. And huge numbers of people just bought it hook, line, and sinker. You can look it up on my blog if you like. Okay, I'm out of time. I just want to wrap up and just say that you know, these ideas about genomic perfection continue today. You know, Maynard Olson says there's much to learn about how to sculpt these materials into ideal human forms, but we now have the tools with which to pursue this forbidden knowledge, okay? These go hand in hand with the kinds of medical advances that we heard about in the last 2 talks. They're not mutually exclusive, okay? And what we get is a neoliberal version of it as opposed to the progressive era version of it, okay? Matt Ridley here says that there's every difference between now modern individual eugenics and the bad old collectivist progressive era eugenics, but I want to argue that they're different, but modern eugenics doesn't solve the problems of old eugenics. It just creates different ones, okay? Here's Lee Hood talking about personalized medicine, and I just want to put this up here to show you that how similar is this language to H.E. Jordan's from 1912. For each defective gene, there will be a therapeutic regimen that will circumvent the limitations of the defective gene. Thus, medicine will move from a reactive mode, curing patients already sick, to a preventive mode. Okay, so these ideals are still with us. Okay, all right. I don't really have time to talk much about CRISPR. There was this famous, very well publicized meeting just last week on human gene editing, but these techniques have also, once again, led to a whole bunch of stories about engineering perfect babies, a new era of eugenics, test tube babies, brave new worlds. The same language keeps coming up in a new guise every time. Okay? Scientists said, you know, a more cautious scientist wrote that, you know, wanted to suggested a moratorium on this, on editing human embryos until we can figure this out. Arguing that that this can be thought of as eugenics, thought by earlier generations to be desirable, but now generally considered abhorrent. I don't know what bookshelf he's looking at, but on my bookshelf, there's a whole bunch of books talking about eugenics and saying it's time to bring it back. We now know enough to do it right. Okay? They made mistakes. Eugenics isn't wrong. It was just done. Right? So this is why we need to pay attention to the lessons of history. The same language of the moral imperative to researching. Some are arguing that it's not only permissible, but it's obligatory to modify our babies. And just in 1 minute, I just want to go through the argument over whether the argument today is that personal choice makes eugenics okay. The problem with it was state control of reproduction. And they say, but now if you leave it up to the individual, that makes it all right. And I want to get this, just squeeze this in because this is going to feed into our discussion in the next session. The argument is called procreative beneficence. And it runs very briefly like this. We have the obligation to produce the best children possible. That means giving them the best environments and also the best genes. okay? We therefore have a moral obligation to genetically modify our own children. No coercion, no state control, okay? I argue no, that does not make it okay. Not by itself, anyway. Who are the best children? The best children, you could argue, are those who have the maximum opportunities, right? Who has the most opportunities? Well, white, straight, rich, and in the Western world, mostly Christian men, right? In other parts of the world, maybe Muslims, maybe others, but basically white, straight, rich guys, right? So procreative beneficence by itself leads to the same tired old Aryan master race by different means, okay? Unless massive social change occurs to equalize opportunity. And that gets us back to the question about the social determinants of health, okay? So this eugenic impulse takes different forms in different times and places. We've seen defective populations, defective individuals, defective genes, defective nucleotides. It drills down deeper and deeper. We've gone from individualism to collectivism and then back to individualism again. And I've argued that neoliberal eugenics is not a panacea. It solves some of the problems of progressive eugenics and creates others, okay? So to wrap up Mendel's legacy regarding social problems, better for answering scientific questions, 13 seconds. Okay. Better for answering scientific questions, some life-saving medical benefits, especially cancer, as we heard, yet the promise consistently exceeds the results. The very qualities that aided rapid scientific advance hindered the addressing of social problems. The simplicity, the clarity, the reductionism of Mendelism was great for doing science, but less good for addressing social problems. So, science and technology must combine with social change for effective answers to these social problems. So, my little rainbow butterfly unicorn kitten hope is that that social change will occur alongside with the advance in science and technology. Thank you very much.